Hi, everybody, and hello to everybody that's online. This seminar is the third in a series of hybrid seminars that focus on the status and multidimensional dynamics of inequalities on the African continent. The seminars are informed by chapters that ACEIR researchers and associates published in the book Inequalities in Southern Africa, Multidimensional Perspectives and Future Challenges. The book aims to shape global discussions and discourses on Africa's inequality challenges and was published by the World Bank and AFD earlier this year. The first seminar in this series dealt with inequalities in human capital and labor market outcomes in sub-Saharan Africa, and the second with migration, inequality, and social mobility. Today's talk by Professor Abena D. Oduro is based on the book's chapter on gender inequality that she co-authored with the AFD's Dr. Serge Rabier and Dr. Rawane Yasser and ACE affiliate Dr. Jacqueline Mosomi. Abena D. Oduro is an associate professor at the Department of Economics, University of Ghana, and a member of ACEIR's Ghana Research Node. She's a former president of the International Association for Feminist Economics and the conference chair for IAFI's 2023 conference hosted by ACEIR's Hub at the University of Cape Town. She has published widely in development economics using survey data to analyze issues of assets, wealth, remittances, and education using a gender lens. What we will do for questions is we will take questions at the end of the presentation. If you're here in person, can you raise your hand and I'll get the mic to you before you make your questions. And for online audience, when we open for questions, you can just raise your hands or you can type questions in the chat and we will manage that from here. So without further ado, thank you very much, Professor Abena, and please go for it. Thanks.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. So thank you very much, and greetings from Accra. The slides are being manipulated from Cape Town, so you're going to be hearing me saying next slide, please. So if I may ask for the next slide, please. So this chapter or this presentation is based on the chapter in the book, as has been said, and we are going to be examining gender inequality along 5 dimensions. And these are education, health, the labor market, unpaid care work, and assets. Now, the last 2 dimensions that we are going to be looking at are not usually considered in the literature. And this is because of the lack of relevant data sets, that is time use data sets, and individual level assets and data sets. In addition, women's unpaid care work has not been considered of value by mainstream economists, which is another reason why not much attention has been paid to this dimension of gender inequality until recently. So once we've gone through the discussion of the different dimensions of gender inequality, there'll be a brief discussion on the legal framework and why it is important in the fight to reduce gender inequality. But first of all, why should we care about gender inequality? Well, we should care about gender equality or attaining gender equality if we care about the well-being of all individuals, women and men. And then the second reason that is usually provided is because gender inequality can act as a brake on growth and on development. So if we can have the next slide, please. So we are going to begin looking at the next slide. We are going to begin by looking at a summary indicator of gender inequality. So the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and the African Development Bank have in the last few years developed an index, the Africa Gender Index, to track progress in reducing gender inequality on the continent. Now, the index has 3 dimensions, and that is the economic and business dimension, the social dimension, and the empowerment and representation dimension. And each dimension has subcomponents, the information of which is used to develop the index. Now, the Africa Gender Index takes a value of 1 when there's gender equality. It takes a value of less than 1 when the male values of the indicators exceed the female values, and it is greater than 1 when the gender inequality is in favor of females. Now, as we can see, between 2019 and 2023, there was a 1.7% increase in the Africa and Gender Index. And this is suggesting that there's been some marginal progress towards gender equality over the period. Now, the examination of the dimensions show that there has been progress in the social dimension, and there has been progress in the empowerment and representation dimension. But what we also need to observe is that we do poorly on the continent when it comes to gender equality within empowerment and representation. However, looking at the change over the period, we find that it is in the economic and business dimension that there has been what one may describe as some retrogression. And further examination of the subcomponents of the dimension shows that this retrogression has occurred in the areas of the share of paid employment in total employment, in the share of vulnerable employment in employment, access to credit, and the share of businesses that include a woman among the principal owners. So we still have a lot of work to do in terms of empowerment and representation, and also in ensuring that we reverse the backward trend that has taken place in terms of economic and business dimension. But this is a summary indicator. What we want to do now is to look at the 5 different dimensions of gender inequality that are featured in the chapter. So may I have the next slide, please? Now, gender inequality is measured in this graph as the gap in enrollment between boys and girls. And we can first note that gross primary enrollment rates in several countries exceed 100%, and it exceeds 100% in some instances for both girls and boys. In the majority of countries, the gender gaps are biased against girls. But in 11, that is about 1/3 of the 34 countries for which we have data, the gender gap is biased against boys. Now, if we can go to the next slide, which looks at gross secondary enrollment rates. And on this slide, what we observe is that the gross secondary enrollment rates are lower compared to the rates that we have at the primary level. And we have fewer countries in this case. We have data for 24 countries in this case, as opposed to 34 countries in the previous slide. Gender gaps exist again. We have gender gaps that are biased against girls, where the enrollment rate for girls are lower than boys. But then we also, in 14 out of the 24 countries for which we have data, we also observe that the enrollment rates for boys is lower than girls. We can also conduct or look at data that looks at enrollment in different slices in terms of the class and location, for example. And what we find is that you would in some countries, especially in the wealthier countries, you would find that gender gaps, although they are narrowing, girls from poor households and girls in rural locations are more likely to be left behind. Now, if we can move to the next slide, please. And in this other slide, we are looking at the share of the working population with post-secondary education. Now, the share of the working population with post-secondary education varies quite widely across the countries. Again, we have about 24 countries. And again, we observe that in a few countries, that is about 5 of them, the male shares, the share of the male population with post-secondary education is lower than the share of the female population with post-secondary education. Now, in the chapter, we don't only look at enrollment rates, we also look at gender gaps in performance in education and in fields of study. And so could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so what we observe in this case is that girls, in some instances, or the data that we are presenting here, we find that the performance of girls can and does outstrip the performance of boys. And we have evidence of this in primary school, and we have evidence of this in the junior secondary school. We also looked at fields of study, and there is evidence that there's low enrollment of girls in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now, it's not because girls are less competent. We have evidence that indeed girls in some instances perform better than boys. So we need to look beyond capacity of girls to be able to understand why we have these low enrollment rates. And so social norms about gender roles, stereotypes about female and male capabilities, sexual harassment, and lack of mentors are some of the variables that have been found and that can explain why we have this gender bias within science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. May I have the next slide, please? In the next slide, we consider policy actions. We've provided the evidence as to the gender gaps that exist in education. And we also consider policies that that could be implemented to be able to reduce these gender gaps. I must say that many of the recommendations that are looked at are focusing on increasing the girl enrollment. So the evidence that is available shows that reducing the direct cost, the monetary cost of schooling, is effective in increasing girls' enrollment. So we have evidence from Ghana, where there was an intervention to provide scholarships to young people who qualified to enter senior high school, but did not have the resources to do so. So those students who received the scholarships, you find that there was a 50% increase in girls' tertiary enrollment compared to girls who didn't. Now, eliminating school fees for secondary girls in Gambia has also been found to improve enrollment. And in South Africa and Mali, there's evidence that conditional cash transfers increase girls' enrollment. Now, in addition to wanting to improve enrollment, we want to be able to improve completion rates, because you find that in some African countries, by the time the girls get to 11, 12, 13, that is when they begin to drop out. So it's important that we improve completion rates. And again, it has been found that sometimes distance to schools can be a problem and a reason why girls are no longer allowed to go to school. So in Burkina Faso, there was a policy to build girl-friendly schools closer to the communities. And this was found to improve the completion rates. And again, providing scholarships to young people, so reducing the direct costs of going to school, increased girl secondary school completion rates. And then also one needs to address the social norms that are a cause of the gender gaps that we see. And so there was an intervention to teach girls in Zambia how to advocate for themselves by providing negotiation training. And this was found to keep the girls in school longer. And may I have the next slide, please? So we are also concerned about improving educational performance. Yes, there is evidence that girls are doing better than boys in some tests that have been conducted. But indeed, we want to make sure that in those areas or those countries where girls' performance is not up to par, that we are able to improve upon their performance and generally improve upon learning outcomes amongst children in our schools. And it has been found that provision of teaching guides and training teachers, therefore improving pedagogy and providing material to the children, has a positive impact on learning outcomes. And indeed, if our interest is on girls, we find that there are positive impacts on girls' literacy. And this is evidenced in Kenya and Tanzania. And in Ghana, we have the school feeding program, and it has been found that the school feeding improves the maths and literacy scores of children with greater gains for girls. And indeed, those students who benefited from the scholarships at the senior secondary level in Ghana also were found to have improved test scores. So that's the evidence for education, and these are actions that have been taken, and that's one may consider in terms of wanting to close gender gaps in education. May I move on to the next slide, where we're going to be looking at maternal health. We're going to be looking at health issues. And in looking at health issues, our focus was on sexual and reproductive health rights. We find that maternal mortality rates are high on the continent. In many countries, we have maternal mortality rates that exceed 500 per 100,000. So how can, and indeed we are lagging behind the goals, the SDG goals that have been set in terms of maternal mortality rates. So how can we explain what is happening here? Well, low incomes, poor governance and funding of health systems, unmet needs in education, and location, rural location versus urban location, as well as the persistence of gendered social norms that are biased against women, can explain the high mortality rates. We also found that spatial inequality in the distribution of health facilities and income inequality combine to put poor women and women living in rural communities at higher risk of dying during childbirth. So again, we find that intersectionality issues come into play. If we may move on to the next slide, please. Now, women carry the burden of HIV/AIDS. The share of the population with new HIV infections, that is female, aged 15 years above, is greater than this demographic's share of the population. So our young women are vulnerable to HIV infections. Now, why is this? Sociocultural practices and norms contribute to this high risk. And gender inequalities in socioeconomic positions also contribute to this. Women tend to have low levels of educational attainment, as we already know, and they also tend to be unemployed and therefore poor. Now, these conditions, therefore, undermine their negotiating power, undermines their bargaining power, and makes them vulnerable, increases their vulnerability to contracting HIV/AIDS. Another health dimension that we looked at in the chapter is gender-based violence. And in particular, we looked at intimate partner violence. And this is perpetuated by patriarchal norms that accommodate violence against women. And in addition, low bargaining power and low decision-making power makes women vulnerable to these forms of violence. May I have the next slide, please? So basically then, what can be done to address these problems that women face in terms of social, sexual, and reproductive health? Well, many African governments have committed to the Abuja Declaration on Health Financing, where the commitment was made to allocate or earmark 15% of the budget to health. So this is something that we're recommending and should be done. But in addition to adequate resourcing, the health sector also requires improved governance and development of healthcare systems that are designed to address the needs of women and men. And there are social norms that control women's movements, their decision-making concerning their health, and these need to be tackled if we want to be able to reduce the vulnerabilities that we see. And then there is also the need to equip young people with appropriate knowledge and information, and also with skills. So may I have the next slide, please, as we move now to look at gender inequality and employment. Now, on this slide, we have information on the employment to population ratio. And we can observe on the slide that women's employment to population ratio is lower than men's. And there are several reasons for this. Again, our gender inequality in education comes into play, where women have inadequate training and education. Then we also have norms that limit women's mobility and limit their and norms that are concerned with limiting women's interaction with men who are not family members. Also, another set of factors that influence women's employment is their marital status and their responsibility for social reproduction. Now, in addition to being concerned about the employment ratios, we need also to be concerned about the type of employment that working women and men are engaged in. And we find that women are more likely to be employed as own account workers and contributing family members. And this is dubbed or classified by the World Bank as vulnerable employment. But the vulnerability in employment is not only when persons are employed in self-employment or contributing family workers. One can also be in paid employment and be vulnerable because of employment insecurity, for example, and not having decent jobs. And we find that women are less likely than men to have decent jobs. So there is the concentration of women in self-employment and as contributing family workers. But we find that in, and there is the evidence that the employment, gender bias in the employment to population ratio is biased against women. But there is evidence when we go in to look at wage employment. There is evidence in some countries, in Egypt, for example, that the bias when it comes to wage employment is the other way. And i.e., we're more likely to find more women in wage employment, a higher ratio of women in wage employment than men. And this has to do with the fact that we have low employment of women anyway, but we have women who are also highly trained and highly skilled who select to go into the labor market. Now we have occupation and segregation, and we have gender wage gaps. And our the gender wage gaps persist due to skills differences. They exist because of the gender gap in education, because of occupational segregation, and the gender wage gaps exist because of women's unpaid care work responsibility. Now, there is evidence, though, studies has found that legal provisions can contribute to reducing the gender wage gaps. So a comparison of gender wage gaps in the regulated formal sector and gender wage gaps in the private sector finds that the gender wage gaps in the regulated formal sector are smaller than in the private sector. Okay, so if we may move now to look at unpaid care work. Now, in all African countries, women spend more time on unpaid domestic and care work than do men and boys. As a result, in the countries considered, women and girls, which we, in the data before us, women and girls spend more hours in a day working when we combine paid and the time spent on paid and unpaid work. Women spend more time working in a day than do boys and men. So for example, in rural Mali, the total amount of time women spend working is 3.8 more hours per day than men. Now, unfortunately, unpaid care and domestic work is not included in the national accounts, neither in mainstream economics, despite its contribution to the economy being critical and substantial. Unpaid care and domestic work is estimated to be at about 30% of GDP in South Africa in 2010 and 22.3% of GDP in Mali in 2018. In Botswana, it is estimated that the value of unpaid care services provided in the home for persons with HIV/AIDS exceeds the value of similar services provided by the state. But as you can see from this table, most of the data in the table is quite dated, and this is because of the dearth of regular time-use surveys in African countries. So what determines who participates in unpaid care work and how much time is spent in these activities? We can consider bargaining power, the bargaining power of women in a household, and we can also consider gender norms. Now, age, education, earnings, and wealth can influence bargaining power. And indeed, it is hypothesized that as women's earnings increase, it is expected that they will spend less time on unpaid care work. It is also expected that an increase in women's earnings relative to their male partners' earnings will reduce the time they spend on unpaid care work. However, there is evidence that gender norms that define what is masculine and what is feminine can undermine the influence of earnings and wealth on women's bargaining power and the amount of time that they spend on unpaid care work. Now, there are several reasons why the gender distribution of unpaid care work matters, and I will mention a couple. Women work longer hours in total than men, and this has implications for women's physical and mental health. And unpaid care work can reduce the time women spend on income-generating activities, and it influences the choice women have to make between wage employment and self-employment. Now, not being able to participate in income-generating activities because of unpaid care responsibilities increases women's financial dependence on their partners, and this can increase the risk of intimate partner violence. And then being able to earn or own one's income increases women's likelihood of participating in household decision making. So these are just a few of the reasons why we should be concerned about the distribution of unpaid care work in the household. May I move to the next, or may we move to the next slide, please? So property ownership in Africa. As we can see from this diagram, men are more likely than women to own physical assets and financial assets. But we find also that not only are women less likely to own assets, they generally own less valuable assets than men, leading to a large gender wealth gap. Now, what explains the gender asset and wealth gaps? We can look at marital and inheritance regimes that are not gender equitable. We can look at social norms concerning whether and what assets women should own. And we also need to take into account women's financial capacity to purchase assets. So what can be done to reduce or remove the gender asset gap? Well, we could consider implementing legislation that will introduce gender equitable inheritance laws, because inheritance is an important means through which asset acquisition takes place. We can also introduce legislation that introduces partial community property marital regimes. And we can consider interventions to shift gender norms. May I have the next slide, please? Now, this slide illustrates the importance of laws and norms in relation to the gender asset gap. Now, in Ghana and the state of Karnataka in India, the marital regimes are that of separation of property, whilst in Ecuador, it is partial community property. And the effects of the marital regime on asset ownership amongst couples is therefore evident. In Ecuador, women's share of couple wealth is about 44%, compared to Ghana and Karnataka, where it is 19% and 9% respectively. Now, inheritance regimes, both statutory and customary, can either promote or inhibit gender equality in property ownership. Now, inheritance regimes that require that all children inherit equally from their parents, and inheritance regimes that do not allow for testamentary freedom and regimes that make provision for spouses to inherit each other's property, are likely to be gender neutral in their effects and therefore contribute to gender equality in asset ownership. May I have the next slide, please? So in this slide, we are looking a little bit more at the rules of legal systems and social norms. And to say that laws and their institutionalization into local mandates and policy programs create avenues for actors and for actors interested in defending the rights of particular groups to mobilize and leverage their demands with legal mandates. Now, we don't have a lack of protocols and agreements at a continental level or at the regional level that are designed to promote gender equality. And I have a few examples on the slide. At the continental level, we have the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, on the rights of women in Africa. It's a mouthful, but is also known as the Maputo Protocol. And we have the recent protocol on women and youth of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Within the ECOWAS region, we have the Supplementary Act relating to equality of rights between women and men for sustainable development in the ECOWAS region. COMESA has a gender policy, and SADC has a protocol on gender and development. And these acts have been in place for at least 10 years, except for the Protocol on Women and Youth of the AFCFTA. So then how come we are not making as much progress in gender equality as we should? Well, these statutory provisions that we sign onto at the international level face a few challenges. The first is that we need to translate these protocols into national law, and we are not very good at doing that. And then when we do translate them into law, there's also the challenge of implementing the laws that promote gender equality and protect women's rights. And then finally, we need to deal with the challenge in African countries that we have plural legal systems, i.e. we have the statutory formal laws and we have the traditional and customary laws, which are recognized, and sometimes they may be moving in opposite directions. And these can undermine the effectiveness of statutory laws. May we have the next slide, please? I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip this slide. And the next slide, please. Okay, so what this slide and the next slide were doing was showing the extent to which African governments are translating provisions of the Maputo Protocol into national legislation. This is work that I've been involved with a colleague in ACEIR and with colleagues from the World Policy Center, but we can come back to it if there's time. May I move to the next slide, please? Okay, so that in conclusion, what have we drawn from this chapter, the examination of gender inequality in Africa along the 5 dimensions, looking at the patterns, trying to understand the causes, and considering possible policy responses. The first thing that we can note is that gender inequality in one dimension can have a domino effect on other dimensions. So gender inequality in education has implications or affects gender inequality in employment, and affects gender inequality in health. Second, we observe that women are subject to multiple intersecting disadvantages due to class, race, age, and ethnicity, for example. And third, we find that female disadvantage is not always the norm. And this comes out quite clearly when we looked at education, meaning that we need to be careful as we are thinking of addressing issues of gender inequality. And then fourth, social norms have a causal effect on gender inequality. These social norms also influence women's bargaining power and power relationships between women and men, and therefore driving inequality. So these 4 takeaways have implications for how we will design policies to address gender inequality. And may I move to the final slide, please? So what we've been looking at so far are policies that are concerned with directly addressing gender inequality. How can we reduce gender inequality? But just the final point that I would like to make, and it is this, that as we implement policies, i.e. the objective may be to respond, which is the problem that we are facing in Africa now, responding to the debt crisis. How can we get our debt under control? We are taking on IMF programs, fiscal consolidation, etc. We need to be sensitive to the fact that policies, which we know policies have distributional effects, but not only distributional effects in terms of class, policies also affect women and men differently. And they affect women and men differently because women have different characteristics, physical strength, education, and women and men have different opportunities and constraints. And this is something that we've picked up in this presentation. And these different opportunities and constraints that women have mean that policies to control inflation, policies to liberalize the economy or to liberalize trade will have differential impacts on women and men, and these must be taken into consideration. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I've gone on for so long, and medasi, as we say in Ghana.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm going to ask if people in the room, if you have questions, if you can raise your hands, and also Iman, if people online have questions, you can please put them in the chat, or you can raise your hands, and Iman can moderate that. But first, to start, does anybody in the room have questions that they would like to ask? Okay, I can start then. I'll abuse my position as the chair. So thank you, Prof. That was, really fascinating. One of the things that I was interested in asking about is you spoke about the differences between men and women in terms of physical strength or education, etc. And one of the biological things that people here at this university I know have been thinking about, I'm a postdoc and other people who are postdocs, is basically the biological issue of child rearing and childbearing, and how there is both a kind of social cost that is extra to women because women have a higher care burden, as you said, and perhaps that can be changed with social interventions. But that then there is also this biological issue in that women have, a narrower fertility window than men. I mean, I can delay when I want to have children until when I'm older, and women can, but that can be very costly or it may be difficult. And I just wondered if that's something that you think is important when we're looking at these employment rates and what the implications are for policy. If it's I'm making my career in a time when for some women it would be more difficult to make their career because they have to make these trade-offs. So I was interested in if you have a view on that. And maybe we should take a... Oh yeah, go for it. Thanks.
Okay, so if I've understood your question correctly, women are at a disadvantage compared to men because of our childbirth responsibilities. And within the context of employment, maybe one way to consider that is using paid maternity leave and paid paternity leave, so that when we have both concurrently, women are not disadvantaged from the perspective of the employer. Because you find that there's work that I'm doing here in Ghana, and employers will tell you we don't want to take on women of a particular age group because we know that they're going to go away and have children. And one of the reasons why they don't want to is because there is paid maternity leave in Ghana. We don't yet have paid paternity leave. But then the paid maternity leave the burden is on the employer. So not only do we have to think about having paid maternity leave and paid paternity leave, we need to think carefully about the funding and financing of this payment, and really think in countries such as ours to take it away from the employer and add it, take it from the pool of money that we have in Ghana. We call it the consolidated fund, so that number one, it is also available to a wider range of women, because in Ghana now, women in the informal sector are unlikely to get paid maternity leave. So that may be one way of addressing this bias.
Thank you. Are there questions online or? Okay, yeah, we have a raised hand. So if that person, I want to unmute and they can ask their question.
Thank you very much for the very insightful presentation. I think I just want to understand in terms of where we have balanced outcomes, because you've said women are not necessarily always having a disadvantage. So perhaps let's say we've had balanced educational outcomes. How then does that translate into the labor outcomes that we see? In such countries, do we still see gender disparity from an employment perspective or not. So in other words, when we have very good educational outcomes for both males and females, when it goes to the labor market, are we still seeing the same thing? Thank you.
Okay, the answer is no. It doesn't necessarily translate into the labor market. This is something we mentioned in the chapter, which is saying to us that it's not only education, gender biases in education that are going to explain what we see in the labor market in terms of employment, even in terms of the gender wage gap. We also need to take into account things like social norms. The women may have the education, but if there's a restriction on the sector that they can work in, whether they can work in the public sector or the private sector, because maybe working in the public sector, there are more regulations, etc., compared to working in the private sector. That in itself can also influence employment outcomes. So yes, addressing the gender gaps is important, but it won't immediately, the evidence is it's not immediately translating in countries to improved employment outcomes for women.
Thanks. Are there more questions in the room or online? I've got another question then, but I want to prefer. Oh, there's a question online. That person can, yeah. If that you can speak, yeah. And non-Tlantla, if you want to speak. We can't hear you, non-Tlantla. Oh, there, maybe. Unfortunately, we can't hear you. Does anybody else have any questions?
Maybe she can put her question in the chat.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. In the meanwhile, then oh yes, Pippa. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for an very interesting presentation. I wonder if you could go back to that map that you skipped over, because you were worried about time, as we do have some time, about the different African countries and to what extent they've implemented in law the Maputo Protocol, and speak to that. Thank you.
Okay. So can I ask for the map?
So while Charmaine brings the map up, maybe we can ask LS to also ask their question online, and then we can take both.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much for the interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask on the education piece specifically, whether we are now swinging to the other side with girls now doing a lot better than boys. And is there thinking now around policy actions that can ensure that we don't end up having a gender imbalance that is flipped, basically? Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so I'll start with the first question, and we have a map up. And so this is showing the extent to which countries have translated Maputo protocol visions into national legislation. Now, what we did was we looked at the Maputo protocol, and then we also made a judgment as to what we thought were the provisions that should be in place to ensure that we improve or remove barriers to access to education. So we're looking at tuition-free primary education, tuition-free secondary education, And then we also looked at if there are laws that prohibit sexual harassment in schools. So based on that information, we then generated an index where the index takes a value of 0, well, a range 0 to 0.5, when the countries literally either don't have any laws that protect access to education or provide for rights to education, where we then have a code of 2.5 to 3, where you could say that the countries have literally translated all that we think is required, which is in consonance with the Maputo Protocol in terms of rights to education. So as you can see from the graph, we are doing pretty well on the continent. We've got swathes of green and dark green on the continent, and then we have the light green on the continent. So we find that most of the many of the countries on the continent have provided more than half of the indicators that we looked at, translated those indicators into national legislation. We have some countries in the orange that I have here between 1 and 1.5 that are not doing very well. We have like 3, 4, 5 countries that are not doing very well, and those between 1.5 and 1.99. So that is what this map is telling us. If we can quickly go to the next map. The next map is looking at gender discrimination in the workplace and to what extent we have translated the Maputo provisions on that into our national laws, where we are looking at laws that prohibit discrimination in hiring, firing, and promotion on the basis of gender. If we have laws that provide for equality in wages, for example. So again, based on the range of indicators that we have, we move from 0 to 0.5 to 2.5 to 3, where indeed we have almost all the laws that are required. And in this instance, as you can see, we are not doing very well as a continent. We have lots of browns, which is 1.5 to 1.99 intermediate. And then unfortunately, we also have some deep reds where not much progress has been made in translating the Maputo Protocol provisions into national legislation. So that explains the graph. I hope that works. Now with the second question, I hope I've got it right. Basically, what I would say is, in many countries, or if I take my country, there's been a lot of policy focus on improving girls' enrollment because girls' enrollment was lagging behind. But we now have this phenomenon where boys' enrollment appears to be lagging behind. And I think this suggests that, one, we need to pay attention not only to what is happening to girls, but also what is happening to boys, and that it has implications also for the design of our policies, because what may be driving slow enrollment amongst boys may be quite different from what may be driving enrollment amongst girls. And indeed, the national averages may be hiding regional or district level differences. And I can speak for Ghana, knowing that although at the national level, girls' enrollment still lags boys, but when you start moving to the district level, the story is quite nuanced. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I don't if we have time maybe for one more question online. Okay, there's 3 questions in the chat. I don't know, Iman, if you want to choose one and you can read one out.
So Nonhlaka asked, what does this mean for countries like South Africa which has implemented a number of policies and regulatory instruments and the funding is insufficient, creating sustainability issues on various programs, for example, subsidized housing, education, employment, and labor programs, even have maternity leave, WGE bill, free health, free education, and even introduce gender responsive planning, budgeting, monitoring, reporting, evaluation, and auditing.
Okay, so what I'm understanding from this is that South Africa has, should we say, the infrastructure, it has the laws in place. What we need to have is the implementation. And that's a challenge that even countries that have the laws are facing. So having the laws is one important step, because it also means that if government is not meeting its responsibility, it's in the law, you might be able to go to court to try to see if this particular right can be realized. But then the South African example shows that there's a lot more that has to be done. Having the laws in place is an important first step, but there's a lot more that has to be done in terms of implementation.
Okay. It is basically 2 p.m. in Cape Town. So what we would normally do at this stage is that if people want to leave, they should. But Professor, I don't know if you have some availability for another 5 minutes for the remaining questions in the chat, or if you need to leave.
No, I do have 5 minutes.
Okay, so maybe let's look at the remaining questions in the chat then, if that's okay.
Okay. Just wait for the others to leave quickly. Okay, from Comfort, he thanks Professor for the interesting presentation and then says some of the emerging work on women's empowerment and bargaining power within the household is showing differential effects on property ownership based on the type of property ownership and suggests that there is an increased risk of IPV when women own property solely. And this tends to be attributed to backlash theory, where women's increase in economic status threatens traditional roles in the household. Is this a policy issue around marital regimes and social norms? If it is social norms, what role can policy play here?
Okay, so I would think that this is, from the way you've presented it, this has to do with social norms. And indeed, I mean, work that has been done shows that, and even in Ghana, shows that assets don't always have a protective effect against intimate partner violence. And so what role can policy play here? I would say that this is a hard one for me, but it means that we need to go back and think about it in terms of, you know, okay, let me be careful. Sometimes it's also a question of education and if we can try to change value systems, and some interventions that have taken place suggest that indeed it is possible. But it means one needs to analyze the situation very carefully, then to think about how one goes about addressing this. And one also needs to understand what is the context in which this backlash is taking place. Maybe also if the men have employment, for example, are generating their own income, then there may be less resistance to women also having assets and earning incomes.
Okay.
Our next question is from George. He says, thanks, Professor, for an interesting presentation. If you were to transpose higher education system, such as gender differentials, education outcomes, with more women performing better than men at postgraduate levels in South Africa, for example, work opportunities, gender pay gap, etc., onto primary and secondary education in Africa, will the findings be any different?
I'm not able to get the point, the question that is being asked.
George, if you'd like to speak, I'll allow you to unmute and clarify, or you can type in the chat. In the meantime, there's another comment from Lorato here. where she says, Josh, this is more of a comment than a question, but Josh's question regarding the fertility window is very interesting. Golden's work shows that men are not necessarily delaying family formation, but are instead advantaged by prevailing childcare systems, encompassing childcare provision, family-friendly leave policies, progressive gender norms, etc., to do both career and family in ways women can't. A well-functioning childcare system would drastically lower the cost of the decision to have a family for women.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that comment. Okay, I'm not hearing from George, and indeed, yes, he can get in touch with me.
Thank you so much, Professor, for speaking. That was really very, very interesting, and we really appreciate it. Thank you. I just wanted to let everybody else know that the next seminar in the series is scheduled for the 29th of October and will focus on Africa's sustainable growth in the context of climate change, poverty reduction, and inequality. And the book can be downloaded for free on the AFD website, and the recordings of the seminar available on ACEIR's YouTube channel. But before we go, I just wanted to give a round of applause to thank Professor Abena for her presentation.
Thank you very much.
Bye.